Okay, I think we're good. We'll have other people joining us, I'm sure, in a moment or so, but we will get started. So first of all, hello, welcome. My name is Chris Kilford. I'm the co-editor of the Canadian International Council's online magazine called Open Canada. I'm also the president of our Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria. I'd like to welcome you all, our CIC members, our guests, of course, our guest speaker, Jamie. Hello, and we're glad that you could join us today for this Open Canada event. Before we do start, it's important to recognize that in my role as the co-editor here in Victoria, I live, work, and learn on Coast Salish territory and in the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And for those of you that are joining us who are not CIC members, we're an independent, membership-driven organization. We like to bring people together to talk about international issues, Canada's place in the world, and we have 18 branches across the country with members who are, just wanting to get together and talk about this complicated world in which we live. And you can find out more about us by just Googling the Canadian International Council or visiting our website, Open Canada. We are recording this event. We will also have a Q&A session a little later on. And if you want to ask any questions, you just have to go to the bottom of the screen into the Q&A area. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that by now. And type away and we will get to your questions. So there we go. That's the formal part of today out of the way. And so I'm delighted that we have our guest, Jamie Bowman, here today. And for the past 20 years, Jamie's been working as a legal consultant in some of the world's most challenging environments. And she has her new book, Bike Riding in Kabul, and I have some copies behind me. She has lived along the way in her travels in buggy hotel rooms, as she writes, converted shipping containers, which I know a little bit about myself, and recycled safari tents. And she's a California native, a graduate of the University of California in Berkeley, and a member of the State Bar of California. And she's currently dialing in from Washington, D.C., where she lives. And we're here today to talk about Jamie's book, Bike Riding in Kabul, which is terrific, by the way, and has lots of great reviews. And I know a sequel is in the works. So Jamie, welcome to Open Canada and the CIC. We're glad that you can be with us today. And how's the weather where you are?
Well, I haven't been out yet, but it's pretty nice considering it's Washington, D.C. and the spring. We're really enjoying it. But first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. If we hear a helicopter, that's probably the president going down to the White House. That's how close I am to the White House. So I apologize for that in advance.
And I previously apologized to Jamie if we hear float planes in the background, because I'm here in Victoria right by the harbor, and we sometimes get quite a few of those float planes coming in and out, but it'll be fine. So let's get started about your book, which I've read and read again to get ready for today. And it's covering a period of from 2002 to 2010, and it starts in Kosovo and it ends in Afghanistan. And over this period, you got to see so much, to do so much. And I guess at the end of the day, looking at all of that, what were your motivations to try to bring it all together in the book? And what were you hoping to achieve?
Well, I went to law school, of course, and I'm a lawyer, so I went to law school. And when I got out of law school, I really didn't feel like I knew how to practice law. We didn't have clinics back then, and we didn't have the sort of, there were certain things you could do, but most people graduated and they were lost. So having worked in 20 years in development, I thought that I could write a book that would give people a heads up on what they can expect. So it's not telling you how to think, but it's giving you an idea of what you might encounter. Like, even though you're going overseas and you think that you're helping global development, you might have a toxic boss. You might have a colleague who's kind of a jerk. You have to be aware to take care of yourself, be aware of your physical presence, take care of your mental state. because the books that are out there, and I've read so many of them and I've taken away quite a bit, a lot of them aren't that interesting to read. So I wanted to write a book that was readable, fun, entertaining, that would allow you to take things away to help you if you're working overseas, or even if you enjoy traveling.
Yeah, I think what you just said is really important, because many people heading into the world of international development for the very first time, they have a quite romantic view.
I did.
Right. About going out and helping people, and that's great, because you need to have that. But when you do get out on the ground, you encounter how difficult things are and the people that you're dealing with, and quite often holding your nose at some of the situations you see. I mean, at the end of the day, doesn't it, when you're out there on the ground, doesn't it take a toll on you? Or how do you see your way through sometimes?
It took me longer and longer to recover from projects. I can say that.
Mm.
And I don't know if that was age or just fatigue, but there were things that but it's not so different than a job here. But I think you do go over with this a romanticized idea that everybody's going to pull together and everybody's going to work the same way and we're going to share information. But that just doesn't happen. There's a lot of different agendas. People have different incentives. There's a lot of money involved in international development. So there are people jockeying for positions. And so I was not aware of that when I first went, and not that I condemn that in any way. It's just a fact. And you could take away from my stories what you will, but it just gives you an idea of what you might encounter.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to come back to that a little later on. And because when we started our call earlier, before everybody came into the room, we were talking about Ukraine. And I went to Ukraine as a student, a 16-year-old student back
Oh
in
my gosh.
1978,
Oh my
during
gosh.
during
That's
the
amazing.
Cold War. So quite fascinating to have had that experience. And the war in Ukraine is on our minds. And it was 20 years ago, roughly, that you were off to Moscow.
Right.
Um,
2004.
2004 for a World Bank project. And there's a great line in your book where you say, and I quote, this is somebody talking to you, saying, "They are Russians, Jamie. They will lie and lie. And even when they have no reason to lie, they will lie. It's their culture." Armed with that advice, I boarded a plane to Moscow. So you spent 6 years back 20 years ago in Moscow with the World Bank, working there. Now you fast forward to today, we have the whole situation in Ukraine. You were mentioning to me earlier about those experiences in Ukraine, and I wonder if you could just talk about that.
Well, this whole idea that the invasion of Ukraine is a surprise, I don't believe that, because when I was there in 2003 and I was working on the mortgage law, so I'm not on the front lines, I'm not in any secret meetings. It's just a matter of when you walked into a store, if they thought you spoke Russian, they wouldn't listen. It's like it had to be Ukrainian. And then I'm like, well, I don't even speak Russian. It's like, okay, then come in. And they were helpful. When you met a Russian, someone who was visiting, it was like, this is not a real separation. This will not last. It's like Ukraine has always been part of Russia. It always will be part of Russia, and time will tell. So it was kind of usually when people were surprised at this. I'm not condoning it in any way, but it was always, at least the Russians always knew that this was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bill Clinton had an interview not too long, and he said, yeah, he expected it as well. But I said it
Right.
first.
Right. Well, it looks like, well, it's, when you were in Moscow back then, 20 years ago, uh, what was it like? The country had collapsed. It was coming back. You make some interesting observations about how Russians viewed Gorbachev versus Stalin.
Right.
Could you talk
Well,
about that a little bit?
it hadn't just imploded, they had just had the Olympics as well, and the Russians had lost terribly. And so it wasn't the Sochi Olympics, and they hadn't done well, and so they were smoldering under that as well. And they were on probably at the lowest of Russia, and they were just about to start moving up Putin was on the scene. There was the Chechen slaughter, and where I think 365 people were killed in a gymnasium down in Chechnya because they were rebels. The rebels came in and took over the gym, and then Russia responded with massive firepower, and many people died who shouldn't have died. And Putin said at the time, we do not negotiate with terrorists, we eliminate them. And that's exactly what he did. So one thing about Putin is, like, he does tell you the truth. He tells you he's going to be brutal, and he is. But Russia is like, it was glorious for me because before that I had been in places like Podgorica, Kosovo, Dhaka, very small, underdeveloped, no, not small, but underdeveloped cities. And Moscow is a magnificent city. No matter what you think of the Russians, they have those museums and they have those parks and music, and there's a lot to do in Moscow. So it was a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you do bring up in the book is the Beslan school hostage crisis in 2004. I think it was September 1st, when Chechen rebels took over a school and had 1,000 hostages. And I remember watching it play out on television. And I guess you were on the ground.
I was, and it was amazing because I just come back from Finland. It was like, okay, let's get to work. And it was like, wow, it was an amazing time.
And yeah, and then yeah, of course there were no negotiations per se, right? At the end of the day, it was an all-out assault on the school. There were, as you say, over 300 dead, and
a lot of them children.
A lot of them children, and it gave you sort of an insight as to how Russia operates and how they operated during that whole Chechen crisis. And your point about the whole language issue, I was just in Latvia last summer, and in response to the war in Ukraine, the Russian language has essentially been banned. You know, you can't send your children to school if you're from the Russian minority in the Russian language. You know, you can't do that. And then in my work as a defense attaché cross-accredited to Georgia, I would go with some of my friends who spoke Russian, who were also cross-accredited, and in the shops and restaurants, they never wanted to hear the Russian language. And these are the realities, I think, when you're in international development work or in some of the work that I was doing. And these are the things that people in the West sometimes don't realize, that there is a lot of animosity in the region, right? Between Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and all of this over past difficulties. One of the things in the book that you mentioned, it comes up a fair bit, and that's 9/11 and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and all of the people that you met out there who wanted to give you their unsolicited opinions of America's, their view of America in the world. And I think from what I could gather in the book, you're out there doing, good work with various organizations, but encountering a lot of animosity directed towards the United States. It seemed to me that it was a surprise to you to encounter this.
I think it's a surprise to any American who goes overseas. Remember, we were the originators of the Marshall Plan. I think there was part of me that went over there believing that there was still a lot of goodwill. And even though that was back at the end of the Second World War, I know when I traveled with my father to Paris, he was kind of expected to be thanked. And this was like all the way in 2000 and in the late 90s, someone did come up to him and say, were you in the war? And they did thank him. I couldn't have scripted it better. But for the most part, there's a sense, I had a sense incorrectly, that there would be some leftover bonhomie, for what we had done in the past. And I'm not saying it's not there. It's not there. We are making our own way now. Let's put it that way. We're making new history about how we deal with the rest of the world. And we can't rely on those older successes because we've had a lot of less than successes recently. And people want to hold you accountable for it. Like personally, I don't particularly understand that. I always wonder if I met a German, would I bring up the Second World War? But I always felt that people felt free to do that to me. And mostly because I'm engaged, glad to engage people in conversation, but it was interesting.
Yeah, I think at one point you get quite annoyed. Was it the museum in Moscow that you were touring, looking for any indication of America's help to Russia
That was
during the
Ukraine.
war? Ukraine, the
That was Ukraine.
Lend-Lease program, and
And
there's
it was
hardly
this
a
big.
mention.
They had 3 floors of memorabilia from the Second World War, which is called the Great War there, and that was all they had about the United States, because they don't view it that way. They view the Russian defeat of the Nazis completely differently than the rest of the war.
In the book, you also speak about Afghanistan. You went in and out of Afghanistan a lot. And I know many of my friends and myself, I spent a year in Afghanistan. So I was reading your book and empathizing with you, and it was reminding me of my own time there. And you have a line in the book, and I'm going to quote this. It says that here we go, quote, "My first weekend in Kabul confirmed that once again, I didn't fully appreciate what I was getting myself into when I accepted the job." That was a terrific line.
But it's true. It's every place is so different. Although so many of the reforms that are necessary are the same. Everybody needs clean water. Everybody wants good health. Everyone wants a justice system that works. Everybody wants a parliament. Everybody wants this. I think let's say everybody is like there's a push to go in a certain direction, but when you get there, everything on the ground is completely different. And in that book, I talk about in 2005, I was able to walk down the street. And so we would walk to the big marketplace and see if there was something we would want to buy. I mean, that was a weekend activity. But because my skirt had a slit in it, this big off the ground, it was an ankle-length skirt, people would stop and scream at me for being immodest. And so I had to get used to that. And I had just come from Bangladesh, another Muslim country where what I wore was absolutely fine. So I had to make this whole new transition and be much more modest.
Well, it was 2005, right? You were assigned with the Ministry of Commerce.
Yes.
What was the job in the Ministry of Commerce?
The idea was they wanted a foreign investment law to attract foreign investment. You won't get big corporations to invest in a country unless they're assured that they can take their profits out, they can hire their own managers. They just want certain guarantees that they're not entering a quagmire of business. And so the first step is to have a foreign investment law. We don't have one in the United States, but they have them in a lot of places around the world. And it was felt that if one was a clear guarantee was on the books that would encourage people, it didn't. The number one issue in Afghanistan was always security. And so I don't think it worked very well. In fact, the security went down after that. After 2005, it got worse. So it probably didn't do that much.
Well, I mean, this is an undercurrent in the book. When you're going into Kosovo and Moscow, Ukraine, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and all of that, you are really trying to, at warp speed, bring into place regulations, laws, etc., to countries that either haven't had them, period, or they're in a state of mess, confusion, and so on. It's really fundamental nation building, right from the get-go. And I think in the West, in particular, we don't get it. We expect people to go in with their international monies and aid and all of that and sort it all out, but we don't realize how broken many of these countries are.
Let me say one thing about that, and I did put the story in the book, but it dovetails to what you're saying. When the U.S. arrived in Afghanistan after the invasion, the central bank was literally a decrepit building with the doors swinging open and closed, bang, bang. There was no security. The staff that did show up to work was cooking their meals in the hallways. There were no computer systems. There was very little going on because of the way the Taliban was running the country. They probably didn't need a central bank proper. So when that was changed with the invasion and the coalition, it's not just the US, the Canadians were there, of course, they refurbished the building. They started training security to make sure that the right people came in about sign-ins. They started training the new generation of regulators, accountants, how to move paper around the building. It was a colossal effort. Now, the fact that there was a huge default is something else altogether. But the coalition trained 2 generations of Afghans. And no matter what has happened, and I know it's very controversial, and I'm not supporting the withdrawal the way it was done, it has nothing to do with that. But there is 20 years of training, education, language skills, using computers, knowing how to show up to work, which is something that we can never forget.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And the year that I spent there, one of my jobs was to meet different groups, journalists and academics and so forth, and show them what was happening on the ground. And people would come in, and they were often skeptical about our work there. They thought it was a big waste of time in many cases. But if I ran them past a school, a girls' school at lunchtime, when 1,500 young women in their burqas and headscarves were coming out, people suddenly the lights went on. Oh, wow, we are making a difference. We kind of threw it all away in many respects in August of 2021. We gave up too easily, I suppose, but then again, the corruption. I mean, just dealing with the overall corruption. You went back to Afghanistan. I think in 2000, after you left in 2005, you'd said you would not go back because of the waste of funds and slow progress. But in January 2010, you did go back with USA Aid, right?
I did.
And so what motivated you to go back?
Well, Obama had just been elected, and he had this whole new plan. It was the uplift. It sounded, I mean, I bought into it. I thought it was legit. I liked Obama. I really wanted to support him. And this seemed like a good way to do it. A lot of lawyers don't go over there. I was familiar with it, and I thought, well, this is great. I'm going to be in Kabul. I'll be able to, help with what's going on. I know the credit stuff. This is me. And then they sent me out to Panjshir, which is like one of the few provinces that had no credit. I mean, the amount of credit they had was women pooling their funds so they could buy a goat, raise it, sell it, and then split up the profit. That was credit. And so I did what I had to do. I went out there and I tried my best. And then I was pulled back into Kabul. Yay. And I got to be there for like 8 months.
And you, at the time, you were getting in a lot of trouble when you were in Kabul the second time around with the folks in the Afghan central bank, right?
Not the central bank. It was the consultants.
The consultants, right? The consultants were upset with you
Yes.
because you were pointing out issues with the bank and corruption. And
yes.
And boy, that all blew up, didn't it?
It did. It did blow up. And I thought, I saw it coming. I'm not just piecing things together. It looked more and more fragile. And I thought, when I heard that there was a default in Kabul Bank, a run on the bank, I thought I would be delighted for being right. And I wasn't. There was no feeling of joy over being correct. That was a terrible tragedy for that country. It's going to take a long time for the people to be confident in their banking system again, which is a big problem. But I point that out because sometimes if you're on the job too long, you lose sight of what you're supposed to be doing. And I think that's sort of what happened there.
Mm-hmm. In getting ready there, so for folks that are involved in international development, Afghanistan was a special case. I mean, there are other places you go to where you have to do preparation, right? If you might be kidnapped, you might have something happen and you need to be able to deal with it. In the case of Afghanistan, I was reading in the book, you had to go on some weapons training and you had to fire all of these weapons. And I think you asked the instructor how you did. And he said to you that there would be no harm in playing dead.
Personally, but that training, I think that Holbrooke was behind all that. And so everybody who went overseas for the Obama uplift went to Indiana. Not only weapons training, it was how to avoid being kidnapped.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how to run people over. I mean, you could have no hesitation there, but you started with handguns, and I never held a gun. They're so heavy. I mean, you were an expert, right? But I was surprised at how heavy a handgun was. And then you can shoot everything to rifles. And then there's even the 50 millimeters if you're the one that wants to do that. They also put you in a Humvee and they roll it over. So you'll have a sensation of what it feels like to be in, you're strapped in and they roll you over. And I think 1,000 people had been in that before me. And so when we roll over, all the pennies and toenails and, pens and pencils that had fallen out of everybody's pockets rains on you. It's like, okay, that's it. I'm not going to be in a Humvee that rolls over.
You should have put that in the book. I've never been in that situation. I mean, I've fired a lot of weapons, but not having never in a Humvee rolling over like that.
This was slow. And the other thing, I had some security guards in Afghanistan. I mean, we had security, and so our vehicles were heavily armored, and they were kids, of course, our security guards, young men, and women. And so what they would do is they would park on a little bit of an incline, so the door would be too heavy to open. And so it was like, they thought that was funny. So.
Well, in Kabul, I had a Toyota Land Cruiser assigned to our office. And
oh, nice.
People, again, this is being out in the world, and those doors are heavy, right? And
crazy heavy.
It took a lot of effort to close the door of your Toyota Land Cruiser. No problem, you got used to that. But what was happening, what I found when I came home for a break, I'm in my normal car, and I wanted to close, and I almost ripped the door off because I put so much force in behind closing the door. I mean, the glass was like an inch thick to stop bullets. If you were being shot at. One part of your book reminded me of an experience that I had in Afghanistan, and this is when you were in a container and you heard those missiles flying overhead. And for me, that experience, it was my first night actually in a container in our embassy compound, and 2 missiles went overhead. You could hear the shh, and then in the distance, boom, boom. You knew that they were shooting at the U.S. embassy, so that was okay because it wasn't us.
You weren't far away. You were just on the other
we weren't
side,
that
right?
far away. We weren't that far away. But I guess my point is, many of these tasks you took on when you go to places like Iraq and so forth. It's not just going to the office every day. I mean, you're putting your life on the line, and.
I gotta say 2 things about that. When you talk to other consultants who are in those situations, they say it's your time, it's your time. You can be killed in a bathtub. You can be killed, just as easily other places, and you sort of buy into that. You think, well, yeah, there is something to say that just to make yourself feel better. But I also am a rule follower. I'm not the one that tries to sneak out of the embassy compound or stays out too late. I think that most of the people, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings who might have lost a loved one under different circumstances, but I think the majority of people who follow the rules did okay, at least, in Kabul itself. And I was that person.
There was a whole other world in Kabul too. If you were involved in international development or in some of the work that I was doing, there was this whole world of very, very nice restaurants, nightclubs. I once, almost by accident, found myself in a disco in downtown Kabul full of foreigners.
But Afghans couldn't go in.
No.
Afghans couldn't even go in. So yeah, it was definitely a foreign scene. In fact, there's a series, and I think it's British, that is about a restaurant in Kabul during that time.
Mhm.
And gosh, I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's funny. I mean, you will like it because it'll remind you of some of those things.
And I think that's the other part of getting into the world of international development, right? There are other worlds there, people that you're helping live their world, and you're still getting to keep your part of the world with you. And there are people ready to cater for that too.
I was pretty lucky though, because I went over with an expertise. I mean, I did credit for a number of years before I went over there. So I had the confidence in that. I don't, I'm amazed at the humanitarians who go over there and take on the really, really difficult jobs of trying to change social perceptions, the agriculturists who try to change the way local farmers operate. Those are really different things. Usually when you work in credit, you're dealing with the smart guys, smart women who like understand trade, especially in Afghanistan. I mean, it's like they pride themselves on their trade, and for good reason. They know what they're talking about. But I think compare on the scale of 1 to 10, I think mine was a lot easier, a lot more straightforward than what a lot of people do when they go over there.
I'm curious now, 2023, are you seeing anyone offering contracts in Afghanistan to work on the financial side of the house with the Taliban government being in power?
No, I'm not, but I don't really look for them. I know the last time the Germans were in there helping the central bank, but the feeling was that more help was needed. It's a big deal to run a central bank. I mean, you have to do currency, you'd have to do monetary policy, bank supervision. There's a lot of pieces to it, payment systems, and they will need help. I doubt if they really will be soliciting Americans, but I do know Americans are going back.
You do,
I
right?
do.
Yeah, I've had some people that I know go back and talk about their experiences, and it's different, it's changed, but in some respects they're able to get into areas of the country that they never were able to before because of security. The security is better, and I think though it's a challenge for women, obviously across the board, whether it's education for Afghan women and girls, or even working with the NGOs, that hasn't been resolved either. One of the places you worked and you talk about in the book is South Sudan, 2006, 2007. And there's a point in the book where you get this, I think you get a phone call. I think it was this case, you get a phone call from a recruiter looking, or was it there or somewhere? No, I think it was there, looking for you to go there,
Right.
listing off a long list of things, requirements you have to have.
Yeah.
You have some of them, but not all of them. But as soon as you say yes, you write in the book that the person on the other end of the phone squealed in delight that you would take this mission on. And that might have been a giveaway that you perhaps wouldn't want to go there.
Yeah, I didn't think that through entirely, but I'll tell you at the end of it, Sudan was really an amazing experience. But the minister I worked with had a reputation for being honest, and that changes everything. If you are working with I don't know how people work for the dishonest ministers, but he knew his priorities, he knew where he wanted to go, and it was like he turned me around, pushed me out the door, and said, "Do it," and I did. And it took a long time, and I did a lot of drafting, and we put a lot of things in place. It's fun. Every so often I go back and there's a review of some of the laws I've written by UN or other agencies, and they say this is good, this is good, this is good. So I can walk away that I did some good. I pains me to see that Sudan is having troubles again, but although I complained a lot about it, I complained about living in a tent. There was always a lizard in my tent. I could hear him scrambling around at night, but it was a good group of people. It was interesting work. At the time, there was some optimism. I talk about having a 2-day conference, and people came from all over the country. They were flown in, and they spoke about their hopes for the country, where it was going, how they're going to do. And it was really, really touching. Now, did that work out so well? No. But at the time, I put my all into it, and at least they couldn't blame it on not having enough support, because we really worked on that.
Yeah, and I think you're watching Sudan implode, and South Sudan had its issues as well. You watch what happened in Afghanistan with the withdrawal. Um, you see what's happening in Ukraine today, and you've worked in all of these countries trying to get them to stand up on their feet, and it's like, well, that little thing we say where two steps forward, one step back, right? And when when I think about, I wanted to ask you what you thought about, and we kind of touched on this, the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, the way it happened, on all of that sort of thing. And you mentioned two generations that we trained. I mean, do you think, from your perspective, should we have stayed? Should we have just tried to keep going?
I don't know. I don't think that's a fair question to ask me. It's not my area of expertise. I really pride myself on being the worker bee. It's like, send me in there. I'll help you with the laws. I'll help you with the policies. I am surprised that there wasn't more resistance. But when I went there when I went there in 2010, we had speakers, and they said that if a family has 2 boys, 4 boys, they'll send 2 to the Taliban and 2 to the new government. So they were hedging their bets. And that, to me, that sort of explains a lot of it. Maybe there wasn't the commitment there. Maybe they were still hedging their bets in the end. But if you want to ask me about, I just don't want to step on anybody's toes, because I'm not the person to answer that. It did break my heart, though.
But that little insight you had about the families, the commitments, and hedging their bets. I mean, Afghans have had to do this decade after decade after decade. It's not new, and it is an important point. It is easy for us to say, well, why didn't they fight? I mean, the Afghan National Army lost a lot of troops fighting the Taliban, and sometimes people get into people talk about Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires. And I said, well, no, that's just simply not really, it's not true. I mean, it's the graveyard of Afghans who get pushed by one side or another. And so I guess we'll have to see where that goes. And one of the aspects of international development work, which again comes up in the book, coming back to South Sudan, in Afghanistan, though, you could get diseases and so forth. You could get shot. In South Sudan, one of the things that you mentioned in the book is a big risk in working in Africa is the fact that you can get a bug, something you can't shake, a disease that can't be cured, only managed. I think that's a really important point for international development work. When you're going into some of these places, you have to be prepared for outcomes that you didn't foresee.
I got malaria when I was there, and I can tell you, when I got it, I knew it was something I'd never had before. I knew it wasn't food poisoning. I knew it wasn't the flu. I knew that I was shaking at points. So I was lucky. I got the type that wasn't fatal. But I was very, very sick for 5 days. Now, my friend Martina, she caught something and they couldn't diagnose it. And so there was a real worry that she would have it forever, either recurring. They're like, oh, we don't know what it is, but you should expect for it to come back. It didn't come back. She fully recovered and she's fine now. But it's true. Those diseases are something that a lot of people will not go to Africa because they feel it's too buggy.
Yeah, my own in-laws worked in Kenya for 20 years with NGOs, and I don't believe they had malaria. Does it come up? Do you get reoccurring cases where it's not a problem?
Not for me. I'm lucky.
When you were in South Sudan, also, this is in the book. You talk about the project that you were doing there. And I think this is something that all folks involved in international development encounter. You said that by the time you were happy to have completed the project you had done, but by the time you reached the camp, post-project blues were already setting in. I was mentally fried and physically exhausted from the work and the environment. And I get that sense from others I know involved in this work. They then always go back wanting to have another go. How big a problem is that when you've finished a tough task overseas?
I had been there for 18 months, living in a tent and living on a compound. And I did, like, there were incidents where the security was deteriorating. Our drivers were always doing something else with the vehicles. So I had to walk from the ministry back to the camp a lot. I did what I came to do. I stayed a lot longer, and I felt that I was turning in the sense that I wouldn't be as helpful. And since there are other people who wanted to go there, it's kind of like I mentioned this before, these long-term projects, you'll have consultants that stay on site for 9 years. Mm-hmm. And I think that they lose the zest, they lose the intrigue, the delight in being there, and it becomes a slog. And I didn't want to be that person. I could have been that person, but it was enough for me, and it was time to move on.
When you finished a contract of any sort overseas, you would come home for a particular amount of time, right? Did you need to sort of rest up for 3 or 4 months before tackling something else, or longer or shorter?
It would depend on what it was. I'd apply for different things, and when things came through, depending on what they were, I'd like to take them. Usually I had a month or two. I did a lot of traveling in between, which is a great benefit of working overseas. So you'll be in, for example, when I worked in Iraq, there was a flight from Baghdad up to Paris. I mean, so it wasn't that far. I mean, in the United States and Canada, things are so far apart. But when you get over in that area of the world, things are kind of like right next door to each other. Mm-hmm. And so that's a lot of fun. And that's a nice way to rest. You get to do something new and different. But as I put in the book, I had to come home a lot because my dad was sick. And so that was part of the reason I came back to the States so often.
Your dad figures a lot in the book.
Yeah, it worked out really well.
He had a few things to say to the Russians about Americans and how they didn't, that the way Russia treats people is not the way America treats people. I thought that was an important part of the book.
Yeah, it was nice to be able to include, in fact, when I first started writing the book, I knew I had this book in me about foreign development and foreign aid. And then I also wanted to do something nice about my dad. And then I realized that they work together really well. So that was just luck. A writer is luck. But I'm glad that worked out so well.
And so for our audience members, if you do have any questions for Jamie, please go ahead and ask them. I have plenty myself, but still, but that option is there if you want to take it. So Jamie, I wanted to ask you about women overseas working on these projects. It comes up in your book. You mention on one project you were advised never to get into an elevator with a man, and if that happened,
that's in Bangladesh,
right? And if to turn away, and if that happened, to turn away and cover your chest, and this is quite a major point that you're making in the book. It's come up before in some of the panel events that I've run on international development, where women do say, for those in the audience that are considering going out and doing this work, that this is a real challenge for women, sometimes being the only woman on a compound of all men in the middle of nowhere. How for you, being in so many different environments, was this an issue for you? How would you go if it was avoiding, unpleasant encounters, shall we say?
Okay, well, let's start with the Muslim countries for the most part. Well, not Bangladesh, but in Afghanistan, and when I worked in Iraq and a few other places, Western women are sort of like a third sex. So you have, Muslim men, Muslim women, and then there's Western women, and they treat you differently. They're standoffish, but they know they have to work with you. So I had one time in Afghanistan when I was working on the standards law, the local attorney wouldn't sit at the same table with me. It's like it just that couldn't happen. He was very, very conservative, and I'm like, okay. So I went home and I started writing the law and putting it together, and then I sent him a copy of it. And then next time we met, he was okay with sitting at the table as long as I was down there and he was down here. We could talk back and forth. And then the third and fourth time, actually, we ended up sitting across from each other, but it took a long time. In Bangladesh and in a number of countries, the men are very aggressive as far as with Western women, because they've seen the characters in the movies, and so they think we're all sleazy and we're open game for them to touch. And so that is a problem. And I followed those rules. I took the stairs a lot of times because I didn't want to get in the elevator. And besides, someone had done me a favor of coming over to the hotel to explain that these are some things I should be aware of. And I felt an obligation to follow them, and they served me well. Mm-hmm. There's another problem though, and that's when you have Western women who get involved with local men, and that happens a lot. It's romantic, you're there, it's an unusual place, and some get married, some don't. But when Western women, I got to be careful here, sleep with local men, the expectation is that when the next consultant comes on site, they'll sleep with them too. And so that is a problem. And so as far as having this wonderful, fabulous love affair in a foreign country, I wish you all the best. But remember, there might be a woman following you, and that can make it difficult for her.
Oh, I see.
Gosh, I hope that doesn't get me in trouble with a lot of people.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it is an issue. Sometimes when the recruiters are calling you up about these positions, these things don't get raised. But a number of my friends have raised it in their discussions as well, because look, I mean, even if you're at home, it can be an issue, even here in your own countries, right? Let alone overseas as well. But overseas, sometimes you are on your own. There aren't that many women on a compound that you can turn to.
And being on your own is something that considered, okay, even if you take these foreign development jobs as a job, okay, I'm going over there to do a job. If you're doing the same type of job in the United States or Canada, you have a support group. I mean, you've got someone to go out with after work, you have a few beers, you complain about the boss, you could talk about something being wrong-headed. But when you're overseas and you're on a compound or you're on a project, you don't have that. I mean, you usually socialize with the people that you work with or the people who are on the same project. And so you can't talk against the boss, or else it's really bad form, because you're someplace that's very foreign and you do need to have those ties. Mm-hmm. And so you just don't have the support group that you usually have when you're home.
Yeah,
and that can make you lonely.
True. Yeah, no, that it is very true, and it takes a toll. I think on a lot of people. When you have been out there and come back, are there any sort of psychological supports that the hiring company provides you, or are you basically just a person to be used, and then when the job is over, you're tossed away?
I kind of felt like I was the person being used and tossed away.
Okay.
But not that the one thing that shook me up was in it was in Bangladesh when somebody grabbed me. In the book, it talks about being in a village, a remote village, and walking in a line with some tourists from France. And the locals stand up, and this is after 9/11, and Bangladesh took a very conservative turn after 9/11. They were angry. It became a Muslim issue, and they took it up and they assassinated a number of judges. And so I was at the end, and so the local men asked, "Where are you from?" And the French are, "We are from France." And then this woman says, "But there's one American." Highlighting that I'm there, and they came down the queue of people and they grabbed me, they grabbed hold of me. And I was very, very worried. I mean, that could have been a really difficult day for me, because I hadn't done anything right. I hadn't notified the embassy I was in country. I didn't tell my guest house I was leaving. No one knew where I was. My cell phone didn't work. I was really stranded. So it could have been a bad day for me.
Yeah, well, I was reading that part of the book and I thought to myself, well, you could have said, no, they've got it wrong. I'm a Canadian. I don't know if that would have helped you a lot, but
Canadian, eh?
yes, well, exactly. I do have a question from the audience. Doug is asking, we in the West seem to think that the people in Afghanistan want the same rights for women as we have. And it is only the extreme right that wants to keep with the old ways. Do you feel that that there's a body of thought in Afghanistan that says, we do want to have rights for women, or is it more restrictive than we think?
Well, that argument, when you see how women are treated in Afghanistan, it's not, we're not talking about the glass ceiling. We're talking about really unbelievable conditions where women, because of the difference, are kept in their mud huts without friends, without education, without anything but the cooking for the family and getting water from a well, that kind of thing. It's not a matter of imposing. It's like, oh, we want these women to go to college, or we want these women to run the corporations. We're so far away from that. But you really do. I don't think it's hard to deny that diversity and having women in the system is really important. So I don't buy into that argument that we're wrongheaded. We may have not done it correctly. There may have been better ways to do it, maybe, that would have been more successful. But the treatment of women in Afghanistan, at least when I was there, and this has been a while, so I put that caveat in there, it's really deplorable.
Yeah, and I think also, from my experiences there, in the main cities, there were some opportunities for women, but once you moved outside of the big cities, opportunities for education or anything like that, it was very conservative. And I think it speaks to the time, not that we have a better way of doing things, although I would say we do, but it takes time, right? I mean, it takes more time than we were willing to invest. We put 20 years there. We made, I think, a major difference on the ground, but we would have had to have stayed a lot longer.
Oh, right, which is pretty expensive. I would have a story about women and the way they're treated. When I was in Southern Sudan, after I suggested that they teach women how to read, there was a group that came over and they had a focus group talking to women. Do you want to learn how to read? Do you want to learn how to write? And they're like, oh, yeah, yes, we want to learn how to read. And so as part of the focus group, somebody asked, well, why do you want to learn how to read? And the answer was, if my husband sends me with a message saying I needed to be killed, I would be able to read it and not deliver the message.
Oh my gosh, really?
You're like, that's a good reason to
Wow.
read. Yeah, that's good. That's a good answer.
I have a question from Tawab. He says hello, and he thanks you for sharing your thoughts. He hasn't read your book and yet, but and he asks for your forgiveness. And could you elaborate a bit more about your main reason naming your book Bike Riding in Kabul? And Tawab, that's a really important point because it is called Bike Riding in Kabul and there is a story. So Jamie, tell us about that.
It is a story, but thank you for the question. I will say this, I've had a lot of criticism of the title. People say that it doesn't reflect the book because the book does cover a number of countries, but the bike riding in the Kabul is kind of a good analogy of what development is like. So I had a boyfriend in Afghanistan who was Argentine, and he talked me into going on a bike ride in Kabul on Friday morning when everybody would be home. And it's true enough, the streets were empty. There wasn't even dogs out there, no buses, no cars, nobody walking along. So we had all of Kabul to ourselves. And we're riding along, and just like you're starting a new project in development, it's fun, it's exciting, you feel like you're free. And we rode into town, and then there was a catastrophe. I had an accident and I scraped my knee, I scraped my elbow as well. And the thing was, it's like, it was ridiculous to think that you could ride a bike in Kabul. I mean, I'm a bad bike rider anyway. And then the fact is, it was so perfect because it started off so well. And then I had to accept the fact that it wasn't going to work. So that's where the title came from. And so many people loved it. And it sounded so exotic. And it's kooky to think that someone actually would go out in 2005 and ride around Kabul in the morning. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that, Jamie. And I would say Tawwab is a very good friend of mine and a former senior minister in the Afghan government. So,
oh my gosh!
Hence the question about the title "Bike Riding in Kabul." And I see actually, wow, our hour is up. I have another question that just came in. Oh, and that's just Abdul's, or sorry, Tawwab thanking us for the question. You have, since this book has come out, you've been all over the place now, even further: Iraq, Vietnam, East Timor, Armenia, Bhutan, Uzbekistan, Cambodia, just some of the places you've been working. And I know another book is in the works. When do you think that might come out?
I'm working on it, but with this first book, I didn't know how much work went into writing a book. So I was naive, and it's like, oh, it'll be done in a month. It'll be done next month, the month after that. But now I know what goes into it, and all the chapters are outlined. So I'm hoping by September, October, that it'll be done, and it'll be very similar to the first. I mean, I people seem to like this book. They like the stories. They like the takeaway from it, and they like the fact that they're not told what to think, but just to be aware of the issues, which I think is really important, one of its best qualities. So yeah, it'll be pretty much the same.
Yeah, it's a real tour de force, the first book. And I just, on the case of Afghanistan, all the work you did, all the work that other people did to help that country, people are still working so hard now to help. And I have a meeting tomorrow, a Zoom call with a young Afghan a fellow who lives in Canada now and is running a program to provide education over the internet to Afghan girls in math and physics and so on. So people are still working hard. And I think at the end of the day, those 20 years that were invested by so many people like yourself won't be wasted. So
I don't think it's wasted now.
No.
There are demonstrations. Everybody who was trained and did get out probably will be able to have a job, at least in the US and Canada, wherever they go. The refugees are well educated. They've had jobs. They know how to use a computer. I mean, that's something in itself.
Yeah, it's also sad though, isn't it? Because they're not in the country. They're not there to help the country. Yeah, exactly. These things that happen. I see. Okay, time's up, so to speak. I will leave the last word to you, Jamie, but the book, here's my copy, well thumbed through, and it's available everywhere. And I highly recommend it. If you want to read more about Jamie's adventures, then head to the local bookstore or get onto Amazon and order a copy. You will not be disappointed, that's for sure. And Jamie, last word to you before we say goodbye to everyone.
I want to say that I was so lucky to fall into this whole foreign development area. It's rewarding. It's challenging. The travel is terrific. You meet wonderful people. And last but not least, and I think this is overlooked, it's fun and exciting. It's to think that I was looking at a career sitting behind a desk processing mortgage problems, and then to be able to go around the world and use what I knew to help other people. And as you say, maybe it's not this 10 years, but it'll be next 10 years. I encourage everybody to do it, at least, even if you do it there are small projects, there are large projects. It's good to get out of your comfort zone. And it's very rewarding in that way. But I really appreciate your time, Chris, and thank you for today.
Well, Jamie, it's been a delight. And so thank you. And for the audience, thank you for taking your time to join us today in this conversation. And check us out online, CIC and Open Canada, where we have a lot of articles about some of the challenging places in the world. And so on that note, it's coffee time here in Victoria, and I know it's the afternoon in Washington. Jamie, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chris.
I hope one day we can meet in person.
Oh, terrific. All right.
All
Take
right.
care.
Take
Thank you
care.
again.
All
Bye
right.
now.
Take care. Bye, everybody.